guys and gals, a warm welcome. My name is Henrik Palmgren and this is Internet Talk Radio, and we're going out worldwide through our website redicecreations.com. Head on over there and read all about what we do and find much more radio and video material right there on the website. We have another ARC convention speaker with us on the line today. If you're a regular listener, you remember our recent programs with Andrew Johnson and Karen Sawyer. Well, today we have Peter Taylor with us from the website ethos-uk.com. Peter Taylor provides the ecological science background for the Ethos team. He has extensive experience of research and policy analysis across a wide field of environmental issues, having advised governments, the European Commission and UN organizations. He has a significant contribution to international treaties on ocean protection and the development of the precautionary principle. Recent work has included consultancy to the UK government agencies and non-governmental organizations on renewable energy policy and rural issues. And he sits on the National Advisory Group for the Community Renewables Initiative, a joint countryside agency and DTI program. And what we can say here then is that in Bath, UK, the 20th and 21st of February, Peter, along with many other guests, will be speaking at the ARC convention. And I know that Peter will be talking about the corporatization of the environmental movement, a very interesting topic. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later on in the program, so do stay with us. But for now then, check out arcconvention.org for more information about tickets, schedule, and accommodations. Do check it out if you're interested in coming. I will be doing a talk there as well, and with a few other known names as well, like Michael Tessarion, Ralph Ellis, Neil Haig, Neil Kramer, Kevin P. Miller, Leo Rutherford, Daniel Tatman, Alan Wilson, and of course then our guest here today, Peter Taylor. So with that, welcome to Red Ice Radio, Peter, and thanks for coming on. Good to have you on the line.
It's a pleasure.
Very interesting to have you here. We have a lot to talk about here, and one thing that I'd like to begin to ask you, maybe you can give us a little bit of background in terms of Ethos and what your group is doing over there, Peter.
Yeah, well, Ethos arose out of a previous group that I'd set up called Terra Mares, which was an international group of scientists acting as consultants, but also in many ways we were activists. And over that period, certainly through the 90s, we'd actually been quite successful in changing the laws. And I then felt that I wanted to be more creative. In those decades, the previous 2 decades, it had been a question of trying to stop the bad guys doing stupid things, like dumping nuclear waste in the ocean or discharging toxic materials when they had no real idea as to where they would go and how they would concentrate in food chains. And a lot of the policies in that time were supported by sophisticated computer models of where the science thought the problem might lie. And our job had been to assemble data and evidence that when things were going wrong, to find out where they were going wrong, and then make sure that evidence and material got to decision makers. And that whole process is heavily protected by effectively a kind of defensive mafia, because as soon as you've decided on a program, say, of discharging toxic waste and licensing it, then any change in that is going to cost a lot of money. A lot of money is invested in processes and options, dumping, disposal options. So we really had our work cut out in changing the paradigm towards a precautionary principle and clean production technologies. And so at the end of that decade, I felt that we pretty much succeeded, and it was time to move on. And I went back to my first passion, which was essentially landscape conservation, biodiversity issues, and rural communities, keeping people on the land, maintaining the quality of that land, quality of life as well as biodiversity, against all kinds of pressures in agriculture and forestry and so forth. And I then felt, from my research experience and my experience of policy work, that communication was as important as data itself. So I set up Ethos, as a communications consultancy. And I would been struck at the time, particularly with my children being mostly boys, how they were locked into computer games with mythic landscapes, virtual realities that were fascinating and highly detailed. And so I thought, well, supposing we could create real landscapes in which you could enter and interact, rather like the computer games. And I tried to float this idea to a number of government agencies, unsuccessfully for about a year, but then suddenly the request came through, we'd like to go with this, we've got some money, and could you look at the impact of renewable energy strategies on the environment, on the landscape, on rural communities and biodiversity to the year 2050. In terms of what it would actually look like if you were living in that landscape, look and feel. And this is something that's completely missing from the analysis. So I got the team together, and that's pretty much when Ethos was invented. I found a real genius-level computer graphics designer, teamed up with him. He knew very little about what a landscape ought to look like. The first attempts at modeling a landscape looked more like kind of Bavaria or something out of Tolkien. But it didn't take long before we got a pretty good model of British landscapes, both in the west, which is mountainous, small villages and so on, small towns, and in the east, which is pretty flat and mostly pasture and so on. Into those landscapes, we put the current infrastructure of pylons and power stations and so forth, so that you could see where most of the energy is coming from in the form of fossil fuels and point sources of energy. And then you project that 50 years hence, where most of the power has to come from the landscape itself, wind, solar, biofuels, tidal, hydro. And in order to get a sense of just how much power you needed to get, we used, there was a British Royal Commission that had actually projected a scenario or pathway to 2050, one in which you don't much care where your power comes from, so you expand nuclear and everything. You need everything. And you're not really looking at the demand side of the equation, i.e. reducing that demand. You're just concerned with supplying the projected growth. And then another scenario, which would be the more ecological one, where you say, okay, this is kind of mad, we need to reduce the demand. And the Royal Commission recommended a 50% reduction in demand by 2050. And then we looked at how you would fill that demand with a mix of technologies and visualize that. And on the Ethos website, there is a download where you can actually enter inside the model and you can view the landscape from different angles. And the reason for developing this technology, which was leading edge, was that every school or every council decision-making body could have their own model of their own landscape. And they could easily see the choices, the different technologies, and the different impacts. And you could click on any particular point in the landscape and get an immediate access to information on employment discharges, whatever the inputs and outputs of the material flows might be.
Right.
In the form of a biomass station, you would want to know how many trucks a day, from how far were they coming, what discharges there might be to the air, and all that kind of thing. And that would be readily available, so that decision makers could say, well, if we want to supply our town effectively by 2050, we've got to, A, reduce the demand so that we can actually supply it locally. B, we'd need, say, 1,000 or 3,000 hectares of short rotation tree coppice to chip and then put into a power station. That would provide a certain amount of power. We can have so many solar roofs. and so forth. And if we wanted a wind turbine, where's the best place to put it so that it doesn't mess up the landscape? Or what scale, what costs? All of this would be available. And at that time, I was also sitting on a government advisory body. We had about £1 million to dispense to. We had 10 centers of expertise around the country where there was a one-stop shop. Any community could go along and find out what technology was available, and what it would cost, how to finance it, how to manage it. And this was all at a kind of local and regional level, so that the technologies could be integrated into other elements of sustainability. You know, why destroy the landscape with massive propellers on stilts, which is what turbines are,
of course,
when you could have a low-profile biomass power station. But what's the differential in costs? What are the different risks? And what's the availability? All of those questions we were working on for about 3 years in Ethos. And unfortunately, we run up against, one of the biggest problems, and that is that, in my view, the real answers, and we learned this from pollution control in the 80s and 90s, the real answers are very small scale, and they're not very glamorous. It's about doing that 1 million times, and there's no constituency for it. There's nobody to make big profits, and there's no governments or kudos for government ministers and so forth. And that's what we were up against. Eventually, the Community Renewables Initiative, which you talked of, on which I was on, I'm not even sure it still exists. I left in 2003. Many of the government people that I worked with also left government because they felt nobody was really listening. People were interested in big multinational projects. The wind power direction, for example, went to the Hebrides, one of the most beautiful and etheric landscapes in Europe, proposing 700 megawatts. The whole of the Western Isles of Scotland probably uses 2 megawatts. A pipeline, then that would be cabled to Glasgow with huge losses in power. Massive subsidies are required to do this. And this was actually agreed by the Highland and Islands Council, local democracy. But of course, they're mostly represented by business interests within the community. The tourist industry was aghast, and the conservation community was aghast. And you had the strange spectacle of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which had actually issued credit cards with logos for renewable energy. A lot of the conservation community over here, wildlife protection, for some obscure reason I don't fully understand, jumped on the climate bandwagon, saying climate change threatens biodiversity. There's no evidence in Britain for that. And then started to gather money, joining something called the Stop Climate Chaos. And were massively in support of turbines until they arrived. They suddenly realized these things are going to wipe out populations of eagles. And then they suddenly opposed them without seeing that they'd created this kind of destructive monster in the first place. So my work from Ethos then translated into producing a book on biodiversity strategies, where I first started to question the climate change orthodoxy. And that was very largely as an ecologist, a professional ecologist, saying, look, actually the climate is changing much faster than the computer models predicted. Now, there are two conclusions from that. One is that carbon dioxide is actually worse than we thought. The other is that natural climate change is actually driving the whole thing. And carbon dioxide is not the main cause. So I then, after I'd published that book, I then decided to devote time to reviewing the science base. And that's what I'm good at. I'm not a practicing scientist. I don't do science. I'm a policy analyst. I analyze the science behind the policy, and I'm very, very good at that. So I spent time in the science libraries, and it didn't take me long before I realized with some shock that there was no consensus behind the front of the UN panel. But I'd challenged UN panels before, and I knew just how wrong they could be, and the processes behind the scenes that lead to incorrect assessment. So it didn't take me long to realize that. But what then surprised me was the closed nature. Nobody wanted to know. And that's changing enormously in the last few months. But when I published my book, which was 2009, the middle of last year, it was completely ignored. I'd written it fundamentally for environmentalists to say, look, my friends and allies, you've been suckered. The science doesn't hold up. And a year before I published, I took the draft and I talked to an old friend and a former director of Greenpeace International. And I just said, look, I just want to give you guys a bit of a warning. This science will not hold up under scrutiny. You could go on for another 10 years, but I think it's going to break, and you really need to find an exit strategy. And it was very funny because he then said, "Oh, you should talk to our man, Rob Watson." And I said, "Oh, I've never heard of him." You've never heard of him? He was the chairman of the IPCC, the UN committee. And I said to my friend, look, he's not going to listen to me. And what on earth is Greenpeace doing in bed with the chairman of a UN committee? They were always the bad guys. And as for that matter, you guys are quoting Sir David King, the government's chief advisor. You're even quoting Tony Blair and the head of the Royal Society. When have any of these people ever taken the lead on a major environmental problem? So you've got to look at it. And at that time, I had only done the science analysis, and I then looked at what other interests were involved. And again, it was shocking. For example, Al Gore produces a film for which he gets the Nobel Prize and an Oscar for Best Documentary. Well, there are major scientific inaccuracies in the film. Everyone knows that. But more importantly, a few years before he produces his film, he creates a carbon credit bank with directors that he pulls out of Goldman Sachs.
Yes.
Called Generation Investment Management. And they have several billions under management. Now, that would constitute, in our parliament, if he was giving a presentation to our parliament, he would have to declare that as an interest. He doesn't mention it in the film.
No.
He even lionizes his former teacher, Roger Revelle, who was a carbon dioxide scientist, for discovering the carbon dioxide problem. He doesn't actually tell you in the film that Roger Revelle never agreed with him, that carbon dioxide would be a problem.
He changed his mind after a while, didn't he, Robert?
Yeah, Revelle was involved in a litigation in that Gore's team tried to sue Revelle and another scientist for defamation because they were saying Gore was creating this scare story. And they lost. and again, Gore doesn't state that in his film. So, I mean, apart from the scientific errors, the main one being that he shows this graph of carbon dioxide and temperature apparently running parallel over thousands and thousands of years. What he didn't say is that the whole science community knows there's a big mystery about that, and that is that temperature rises on average 600 years before the carbon dioxide rises. Now, when you're looking at a graph of 100,000 years, 600 years doesn't register. They look as if they're rising at the same time, but they're not. So whatever triggers the temperature rise may later also trigger the carbon dioxide rise. Carbon dioxide does not cause the warming. So he doesn't draw attention to that. That's probably the greatest error. But what is so shocking is that the Nobel Prize Committee must know all of this. It's in the open literature, and they don't. They give him the prize. So it's you're dealing with a highly political situation.
Why do you think they're doing this then? Are they jumping on the bandwagon? Because, I mean, I've heard all kinds of excuses, if you know what I mean. They mentioned that they want to show that they are concerned about the environment too, and they chose this as a kind of a symbolic thing to give it to Al Gore and the IPCC at the same time. But
it's more than symbolic. My own view is that genuine environmentalists who set up organizations like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, the early people had a good feeling for the planet, for sustainability, for what being green was all about. But as the decades went on and the environmental organizations grew quite wealthy, they become populated by people coming out of being qualified very largely. If you're going to run a big multinational, multi-million-dollar operation, you have to have experienced managers from business schools. And this is what I call the corporate creep. It enters and starts to take over, such that chief executives are recruited not because they have a feeling. For example, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds would bring in as chief executive somebody from the business world who was good at running an organization. And then on the board you have PR, you have people who relate to the press, you have people who will safeguard your pension fund and all of that. So this starts to affect what you do. So for Greenpeace, for example, it becomes obviously less radical because it could lose its pension fund and all of its assets if it breaks the law. Whereas in the early stages, and I was really close to Greenpeace, with two brothers working for it directly and I was consultant, Greenpeace regularly broke the law and was threatened with all manner of court injunctions and seizure of its assets and so forth. And even then, it was a difficult decision because you could lose all the ships. So over the decades, you are eventually dealing with organizations of professional lobbyists. More insidious, I only discovered this in a recent trip to the U.S. There was a point where not exactly where the money came from. It was $300 million from the UN or from the International Monetary Fund or some global environmental fund. $300 million was dispensed to 3 environmental organizations, of which one was the World Wildlife Fund, to pursue the publicity and media and consciousness raising in relation to climate change, i.e. global warming. And that money is going into a propaganda program to spread the word that global warming is a crisis. Obviously, you're not going to spend that kind of money saying global warming might potentially at some future date be a problem and maybe we should take some cautionary action. It goes into alarmist propaganda. And of course, the environmental groups benefit from that because their subscriptions go up. People are scared. So it's very hard for me as a seasoned environmentalist to see this and think, okay, I want to talk about it, but they won't listen. And so the second part of the book outlines how the environmentalists were essentially suckered, I think, by initially, interestingly enough, the science global modeling community.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's really galling because they were the guys who developed the global models in the first place to justify dumping nuclear waste or letting sulfur out in terms of acid rain and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to criticize that whole modeling exercise. And I thought the modelers had gone away, but back they come with Scary Climate Story. And, bizarrely for me, I must have been half asleep at the time, but I was leaving the pollution zone, as it were, to go back to my passion for wildlife and forestry and so forth. And I actually, one of my very close associates internationally, a consultant and part of the Terra Mares network, he went on to actually draft and write the Kyoto Protocol and to represent the South Pacific Islands at the international conventions. And so he completely accepted the carbon dioxide story. Mm. And so did I, but I wasn't that closely involved with it. So when I actually started to look at it and first of all realize that the models were based on a simple bunch of equations and that the very first scientists who did the modeling, we know who they are. They're a small group based at NASA with one guy in Sweden involved as well. There was a little network, probably you're looking at no more than 5 or 6 experts in computer modeling. Mm-hmm. And I can see how they did it. There were a number of parameters, options, and if you ran the models, some of them produced no warming at all. Some of them produced a little bit of warming, some of them produced a lot of warming. And if you just look at some of them, then you've got no story, you've got nothing to worry about. But I think genuinely they thought, wow, if these parameters are right, we could have a problem in 2050, 2100. Mm-hmm. So they asked for more money and to set up a international modeling community. And they must have jumped from 0 to $20 or $30 million a year in the late 80s. Now, in some way, and it would be a very interesting study for anybody out there of a sociological bent, somehow that initial work got amplified and taken up by the campaign community, the environmental community. And I think having, first of all, the science community had already been, their reputation was virtually zero in terms of environmental modeling at that time. They had screwed up on nuclear waste, acid rain, CFCs, PCBs and the death of seals in the North Sea. Forests were dying, oceans were dying. We'd only just averted a major nuclear exchange between sort of Thatcher, Reagan, and the Russians. Mm. So the 80s were really down, the pits for environmental modeling and environmental science, low-level radiation and all of those controversies. So by the end of the 80s, the science community is looking to redeem itself. All of a sudden, here's a problem that they identify and that they will provide the solutions for. Coincident with that, the environmental movements had won most of their battles. Mm-hmm. There were no scary stories. We'd sorted out acid rain, sulfur was controlled, we'd banned nuclear dumping, we'd got in the precautionary principle, we were heading for the Rio summit, which was all about sustainability, and that's when we were going to write the precautionary principle into international law, and that was my work in those days. And so you have these organizations which had been highly successful from about 1985 onwards. I think the watershed was the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior. After that, very large amounts of money started flowing into Greenpeace. Friends of the Earth grew. Well, these organizations were quite small. I know. I think when I first started working with Greenpeace, we the whole team from the director downwards would be sleeping on some floor of an office in the docks with sleeping bags. And within 10 years, you have an office block with professionals and millions and international offices and so on.
Interesting, very interesting.
But what then happens is, having won all the main battles, I'm very happy to then say, right, guys, I'm off to the woods. I've got other things to do.
Yeah.
But the professional campaigners are looking for the next enemy. And here it is, global warming.
Yeah.
And so, again, I had no motivation to question it. Around about the mid-90s, I was brought in by one of the government agencies that I was working for on biodiversity strategies and closely related to energy policy. And they said they just commissioned a piece of work, interestingly, from East Anglia University, which has been in the news a lot recently, with the Climate Gate, the release of the emails and so on.
Yes.
Their team had written a report on the future climate as it would affect countryside policy. And the Countryside Agency, or Commission as it was then called, brought me in as a consultant to say, please look at this report because it doesn't really help us very much. These guys obviously understand climate, but they don't understand the countryside. Well, I looked at the science, and I just said, well, I'm really shocked, If I look at their model, they're predicting that there's a kind of linear increase in temperature in Britain over the next 50 or 100 years, and that we'll eventually have the climate of northern Portugal. I said, you can't assume that. Even within the global warming paradigm, you don't question the engine of climate change. You just know that on a regional level, you can have some areas will get colder and some areas will get very warm. And in Britain, if the warmth melts sufficient fresh water in the Arctic, you can shut down global circulation, ocean circulation. This will heat up the equatorial region and cool down the North Atlantic.
That's right.
And we would have the same climate as Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is on the same latitude, that doesn't benefit from the warm water from the equatorial regions, what we call the Gulf Stream.
The Gulf Stream, yeah.
Yeah. So I said, that's definitely possible. And they don't even mention it. And so then I thought, oh my goodness, these computer modelers, they're just linear thinkers. And I didn't return to the issue. I kept on with my other interests. And meanwhile, the UN is producing about every 5 years reports saying we're now more and more convinced that it's humans that are causing the climate change. Well, when I looked in between 2000 and 2003 at the remedy, the expansion of renewable energy, how many installations, how many turbines, barrages, how many acres of land for biofuels, how many valleys would have to be dammed and hydro schemes built, how many pylons. I just thought, nobody's looking at this. The impact is huge. The whole face of the environment will change. The countryside will be industrialized, and the quality of life will be diminished. Plus, there's huge implications for biodiversity. And so I thought, well, this is a bit odd. None of the environmental groups are examining the impact of the remedies they propose. They're all talking about the impact of climate change, which is pretty damned unpredictable, and in 50 or 100 years, whereas the remedy is immediate because you're building this stuff straight away, and very predictable. And so I put feelers out. I write for a major ecological journal, and just silence. Nobody's interested in doing an impact study on this. And actually, if I cast my mind back to about 1980, my research group prior to Terra Mares, which was an international network, I had a small research group in Oxford. And we did a review for the European Parliament on alternative energy strategies. In those days, alternative primarily meant alternative to nuclear, and that was our motivation. And I warned at that stage the environmentalists and said, listen, just because you're developing an alternative strategy doesn't mean it doesn't have any impacts. You must look at the impacts on community, on political control of technology, and on biodiversity, soil quality, agriculture, the whole thing.
Yes.
And generally that hasn't happened. And this is my main criticism of the environmental groups. Up until very recently, when they suddenly realized the scale of what they'd unleashed, having lobbied for targets without considering the time scale of when these targets would actually deliver any kind of change in the climate. I mean, even on the current model, which assumes most of the warming is due to carbon dioxide, you don't have any impact for 100 years on what the climate will do. But the impact of your policies is immediate and enormous. And they simply haven't looked at it. And the classic example is biofuels, where they lobby and lobby and lobby for targets. The European Union agrees. I don't know the exact percentage, say it's 5% by 2010, I think it was. So that creates a subsidized industry in biofuels. And they go everywhere to get it. Palm oil in Indonesia, whatever's going on in the Congo and the Amazon and so forth. I mean, they go for tropical land because it grows things quickly and cheaply. The land has to be cleared. If it's productive land, that means clearing people. If it's forest, that means destroying biodiversity. Then the environmental groups wake up. The horse is already bolted, and they start screaming about safeguards. How to save the orangutan or the gorilla, or the Tana River wilderness in Kenya, which actually they don't seem to have even been on their radar. That's about to be converted to sugarcane plantations to provide ethanol for the international market.
God.
So, I mean, a lot of people are backing away from biofuels. They realize the mistake, but that mistake was created 10 years ago by naive arguments about targets and without any environmental impact assessment. So this is classic corporate behavior, where the people who are running the show are only concerned with performance targets.
Yes.
They're not concerned with impacts.
And from a political point of view, they're also interested in lulling the constituents out there and say, yeah, we're actually doing something here. We're working on biofuels, and this will help. It's very much lingo, and they want to meet just as you say, the targets on the paper, but they don't understand that this will have tremendous consequences in other areas, parts of our lives.
Absolutely right. And I had an argument with Greenpeace in the early 90s where we just made major achievements in the UN, and I had to go before the UN scientific committees, because they were arguing, look, you've won politically, but our science is still sound. And I was saying to them, no, look, your science is not sound. And I then petitioned Greenpeace to give me some time to show that, because if we didn't show that, there was always a danger that they would come back and rewrite the law. So Greenpeace duly supported the analysis. And I made the analysis in two parts. One was a criticism of the modeling, particularly toxic metals and radioactivity. And the other was how to get it right, how to run a ocean protection system and not make this mistake again. And Greenpeace would not agree to the report being released. And I was wrong-footed because I thought they would, and I had to go before the UN committee and show them the criticism. And they then said, look, we're not going to discuss the science, even though they were a science committee. The proper place for that is the peer-reviewed literature, which they thought they controlled. Mm-hmm. And then they said, but you're very negative, Mr. Taylor. I mean, not a constructive word have you given us? And I said, well, I'm actually not at liberty to release the rest of the Greenpeace material because they don't regard it as their job at this stage to help you. You've got to understand they're a campaigning organization. I'm trying to change their mind on this, and there is a movement within Greenpeace to produce solutions, which was in its infancy at the time. So Greenpeace regarded that as a betrayal, and what I actually did was I did publish in the peer-reviewed literature. What that scientific committee didn't know is that in 10 years previously, the editor of the main marine pollution journal and I had sat on a government committee, and he'd invited me then to publish, and I didn't find the time. So normally, somebody like myself would find it extremely difficult to get into the peer-reviewed literature because I don't have an institutional base. But I managed to do it. And it was probably the only major criticism of the UN that's appeared in the peer-reviewed pollution control literature.
There you go.
It caused quite a ruction at the time. But I was free then to talk about what the safeguard should be. When I look at the IPCC, they have made exactly the same mistakes. They've come to believe their computer model and to ignore the real-world data. Yeah. And it's sad. It's sad because you go to all the trouble of publishing something in the peer-reviewed literature and working for 10 years to reform the system. And unless you watch these guys very closely, they make the same mistakes. And this is where the environmental movement has fallen down. Yeah. Nobody, not a single environmental group, and they're sitting on millions of dollars, has spent any money on critically reviewing the IPCC's work. It doesn't take more than a few months to go through it and realize that it's actually extremely poor science, badly put together, that it obviously distorts. I mean, if you go to the working group reports, that's where the science is actually done. Then you see how it filters through the chairpersons of each working group to the final report. And all of the uncertainty, any criticisms, any dissent is filtered out. And that's what was happening before. And the same system is operating. And they choose the chairs of each working group very carefully. These are government appointees. And the Secretariat is very clever. They know what message they need to put out there in order to have influence with the policymakers. And so you have this dance between the pseudoscientists in charge of these committees and the policymakers. Now, you think, well, that's hardly a major consortium of interest, but riding on the policy are billions and billions and billions of investment. If Copenhagen had gone through, the carbon trading business, which is currently running at about $120 billion internationally, would go to $2 trillion internationally.
You're kidding.
2 trillion.
Oh, God.
And that is a huge amount of business. And if you look at the typical carbon trading, for example, and these are figures produced by a Sunday Times journalist a few months back, I could go and buy carbon credits in Indonesia, or the Philippines, it was the case, if I pay a farmer there to put in a gas digester in his pig farm. So let's assume he's producing 10,000 tons of methane or carbon in the methane each year. You pay him $2 a ton, which is roughly what it will cost to put in a digester. So you're spending $20,000. He gets the digester carbon emissions are reduced in the Philippines, $2 a ton. The person who's done that, then who's a part of a system of brokerage, then sells that to the second in the line, the brokerage, at $10 a ton. And that's some kind of bank. They then sell it to industry here at $15 a ton. Now, the going price for reducing emissions in the West is about $50 to $100 a ton. So it's a no-brainer. Rather than reduce your emissions here, you will buy the credits at $15 a ton. You've saved an enormous amount of money. Meanwhile, who has made that money? The brokers and the banks. And guess who one of the main banks is and one of the main brokerages is?
Well,
Al Gore, setting it up way before he put the film out.
Of course. And he's
and then you have the...
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to interject there that he's also behind the even the software. The companies are developing the software, the infrastructure that supposedly is going to monitor the levels of carbon dioxide as well. RIR software, I think it's called, or something like that.
And this is why the most interesting thing, Henrik, in this particular saga for me at this time is that, first of all, the IPCC's report is full of holes. And I've warned the environmental groups about that. They don't want to know. I've never had a single invitation from any environmental group to speak. Nobody has reviewed my report, my book, and not even the left liberal press haven't either. What is happening is that those political forces who are antagonistic to what we will call global governance, command economies, any kind of regulation of the market. So you're looking at free marketeers, you're looking at the American right in particular, anti-government, you're looking at the conservative, old-fashioned, and I think actually people with a lot of integrity like Nigel Lawson in the UK, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, they are getting hold of the truth about global warming and using it as a weapon. And their enemy is what they call green Stalinism. And I've tried to talk to them and say, look, it's no good just lumping the Greens as fascists. This is what happens in Middle America. The Greens are fascists, Stalinists, socialists, commies, whatever. And I kind of say, look, in Europe, we've actually experienced all of these things, and we know the difference. And it doesn't help to this is a new phenomena. We haven't got the words for it yet. The sociologists have been slow off the mark. We need to understand the phenomena, and it's no good labeling it in that way.
Well, again, that they're doing that from the political camp, from the political point of view. Although I would recognize and agree with the idea that some political groups also have taken, if you know what I mean, refuge in the environmental movement. Hence, that's the impression of what is going on as well. I would say, but maybe you have a different theory about that, Peter.
No, I mean, because those accusations are being made by, shall we say, the right wing, and I have to, very openly, I'm all my life I've regarded myself as a left wing person, not very liberal left, but I care about community and environment. My ideas of progress are not fundamentally technological and material, although I think people need to have the very basics. They need stability and security. From that perspective, I would have been, an ideal, as a student, communist, if I had thought of going into politics, which I didn't. I went into science. And the more I've seen, the first communists I met really disturbed me greatly. I thought, oh, this is ideology. Everything they say is set within a context. And I actually at that time had a lot of respect for Marx's analysis of capital. But what I was encountering were closed ideological minds that were really quite scary. And that was in the peace movement when we first met some Eastern Europeans who shared our objectives. So from then on, I started to look, and I actually went back to university to study a little bit of linguistic symbolism. And so in that sense, what I'm seeing in the Greens is ideology and dogma.
Yeah.
And then I look at the critique of the Greens as effectively scary people who will produce a command economy. And I'm going, is that right? But then, and this is quite recent for me as a realization, I now understand what the sort of die-hard Middle England conservative is afraid of. And they're right to be afraid of it, because it's rather similar to, in my community, the biodiversity rural issues. If we look at the European Union, we're living, since I started to get involved in ecology in the mid-70s, we were already very wealthy in Europe, most certainly Northern Europe. And we didn't need to lose any more biodiversity. Our agriculture could easily convert to high-quality, even organic systems. The EU had in place both a parliament, an oversight, a regulatory office, and so something like the Common Agricultural Policy had all of that democratic safeguard was in place. But the Common Agricultural Policy systematically destroyed biodiversity and community wherever it was applied.
Yes. Simply
because the bureaucrats were in cahoots with business interests. And there may be more complicated reasons for that, but whatever the dynamic of it, that is what happened, and we were powerless, despite enormous lobbying and effort, powerless to actually alter that. And with great trepidation when the Eastern Europeans came in, because their rural environments were relatively sound.
Yeah.
Now we wait another 10 years of this, and you'll be looking at the extinction of bears and wolves and lynxes in Eastern Europe, just as we barely hang on to the bear in Spain or in the Pyrenees or whatever. And so this is, and then there's a whole infrastructure thing again, which is very, very insensitive to these issues: ports, motorways, airport, the whole deal. So imagine then the same system transferred to a global level, without a parliament, without regulations, without anybody capable of monitoring what happens. The Greens have agreed and furthered a policy that would generate trillions of dollars going into the hands of who? Banks and bankers.
Yeah.
They would be left to make all of the decisions. The Global Environmental Facility, which currently makes those decisions, is actually a division of the World Bank. So you have completely unaccountable bureaucratic system, and that is what the right wing is calling green Stalinism. And the two things that are most important here is that the environmental agenda has been hijacked. It's virtually 90% climate. So if the IPCC goes down, and if global warming goes down like a sinking ship, everybody who's attached to it is going to go down with it. And the right wing is going to sink not just global warming, they're going to sink environmentalism, full stop. And that is the most important issue we face, and the tragedy is that the Greens don't even see it coming. They won't even. There are groups here to do with transition, called Transition Towns, which is a kind of global movement. And in my own town, they were very happy to talk, but they've had word from head office. I gave a talk in the town which birthed the transition movement in Britain, Totnes, and their leader said, I wouldn't be seen dead in the same room as that guy. He's a complete wacko. He's mad. Now, it's like I can go over to the States, which I did last week, and talk with some of the leading climate scientists in the world and be received courteously and with respect, and nobody questions my credentials. And they were there were two labs I visited. One was actually very open and very much connected to academic life and the quest for truth. And as soon as I put forward various theories and criticisms of the model, they would just get out their material and go, hey, we hadn't thought of that. And we spent 5 hours. This was a team that was already under time pressure. Another lab we visited was actually more of a government operation. And as soon as they realized I knew what I was talking about, they grew very defensive. Mm-hmm. And I was actually quite shocked that their top scientist who they'd fielded was completely out of touch with the most recent literature, which contradicted the models. And I was actually saying to him, but the IPCC has already agreed that this criticism is right. And admittedly, it's buried in a working group report. He wasn't aware of that because it had been buried. And the various compartments of climate science, they don't really interact at the right kind of level for interdisciplinary studies. So on the one hand, I'm received with respect by the scientists who I'm criticizing, and the Greens over here, all they can do is question my credentials as a scientist, saying he's not a real scientist. He's some kind of policy guy with an agenda. He's a contrarian. And they have just recently got very personal, actually, on the web and on Amazon, having managed to get. I'd sort of kind of kept it quiet, but I wrote an autobiography, which is why I'm part of the ARC thing. I think that's what Karen had read rather than my science work, and it's about the year 1984 when I was heavily involved with Greenpeace and political work, and it was also my baptism on going against the establishment at the same time as trying to pursue a spiritual path in yoga and keep my marriage together. And those three dynamics, I'm very honest about it, because I feel that scientists, sociologists ought to give a good sense of who they are and where they're coming from and how they see the world. Of course, hardly any of them ever do. But and so I wrote an autobiography 10 years after that and published it 10 years later, largely as an exorcism for myself, because those were very, very difficult years, but also because at that time it became obvious to us that behind the scenes of the scientific world and the industrial conglomerates, there were practicing orders of what you would call magicians. This is basically the Masonic networks.
Right.
And they were operating on other levels, and we had to have help on those levels, you might call psychic warfare. And I write about this very openly. And the reason I published it, we're looking at publishing it 20 years after the event here in 2004, was because in 1984, a certain scientist called John Riceland, who worked for the nuclear industry as an epidemiologist, had been opposing the work of Alice Stewart, who was the epidemiologist who discovered that low-level radiation was hazardous. And the industry was in denial. And incidentally, I cut my teeth as a sort of scientist lawyer on changing the laws relating to low-level radiation as a result of Alice Stewart's work. And at that time, I can say that there was one scientist worldwide against a whole consensus of every science institute and the UN committee that low-level radiation was not hazardous. And it was only Alice Stewart's work showing that women who had been x-rayed during pregnancy produced an excess of leukemia in their children. And it took her 15 years to change the consensus, only with the help of activists, anti-nuclear activists. So given that kind of darkness that was going on, and Alice was very active, when Riceland, her main opponent, died mysteriously. And she told me she thought he'd been murdered because a few days prior to his death, he'd said he was going to go over to her side. He'd been convinced. And we did our own little investigation, including one of the directors of Greenpeace, who was also convinced that he'd been murdered. And I then started to think, well, you know, they're using all kinds of techniques to actually carry that out. Now, when David Kelly died, this was the scientist who was the whistleblower on Iraq and the absence of weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
So this whistleblower was under enormous pressure, and he was found dead, as if he'd committed suicide. And there were many questions about that verdict. So I then thought, I'm going to publish Shiva's Rainbow because it reminded me of the whole John Riceland affair. And there were elements of David Kelly's death which could be related to the use of astral techniques, astral surveillance, remote viewing, as it's called, and putting ideas into someone's head. I only just survived in '84 from a very powerful kind of psychic attack aiming to try and get me to commit suicide and convincing me that my family was at risk of being murdered and that I would be framed for it. Now, I say quite clearly in my autobiography that I was psyched out, as it were, and but anyone who reads that, and it's very, very honest, will appreciate how easy it is to get psyched out when you have MI5 or Special Branch or whoever, nefarious people, on your case.
Yeah.
And so I understood a little bit about the David Kelly thing, and so I released it at that time, and I sent a draft to the inquiry, which they thanked me for. I never heard anything further. I was somewhat disturbed to see that Phil Jones, professor at East Anglia, who's under enormous pressure because of the release of these emails, which are very incriminatory. It shows for me a corruption of the peer review process, an attempt to avoid the Freedom of Information Act, and deliberate manipulation of the data.
Yes.
There's no question about it. And anyone in his position is going to feel really stressed out.
Yeah.
He then says he's had a David Kelly moment where he feels like he nearly committed suicide. David Kelly was a whistleblower.
Not a
Phil
cover.
Jones is actually the opposite.
Exactly.
A cover.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. So with this kind of environment at the present time, I have to say I'm kind of, it's so nasty, the whole thing, that I'm really seriously looking at what direction to take. You know, where do I want to be in all of this? I don't want to be involved in these kind of political squabbles where the truth is simply used as a weapon for political advantage. I don't know what's left and right anymore, actually. I'm very tempted to withdraw into the science and say, look, I'm here, I'm available, you want an opinion, come find me. I've got other things to do. I'm not by any means attached to this whole game. It interferes with my more creative work in biodiversity and rewilding. And I also have yoga practice and teach meditation, and to have all of that side of my life pulled out and ridiculed by environmentalists and Greens is, given where I have been in the environmental movement, my two brothers who've risked their lives. It's an unpleasant experience, and it's a strange time.
I mean, I totally agree with you there in terms of how they've skewed the political circus as it was as well, in terms of what is left and what is right in terms of that. It's totally. I think that's going on in every country, and I think that's a way they used to even confuse people, if you know what I mean. That's a tactic in itself to no longer to make people feel that there are no grounding in that sense anymore. What was right before is now going more left, and what is left is almost going right. That's becoming conservative in another kind of way. It's very strange, all of this. So I totally agree with you, Peter. But it's been a really interesting story that you've been sharing with us, and obviously I understand that there's much more that can be discussed and so forth. But I would urge our listeners to obviously go to your website, ethos-uk.com. The book that you mentioned before as well, is this available through that website, or where can people get a copy if they're interested in reading about your personal experiences in all this as well, Peter?
The Shiva's Rainbow is available on Amazon. I think there are still some copies in the distribution network. It used to be available on my website, but we don't have any copies here. And my book on climate change is available also on the website, and on Amazon. So yes, I almost don't want to draw attention to my autobiography, but actually, my feeling now is it's almost as if I've been, in a way, outed. It's like I have a spiritual dimension to my life which normally would count against you in the science world and in the environmental world. I'm ridiculed on Amazon for relating to a discarnate yogic master. And it's like, well, can't they look at my scientific credentials and then go, well, if this guy relates to a discarnate yogic master, maybe there's something in it. And likewise, I have some expertise in astrology. Well, so did Newton and Galileo.
Of course, absolutely.
And actually, one interesting little anecdote, when we were in the more open of the meetings with climate scientists in the States, there is one scientist who was able to predict solar cycles and ocean cycles like El Nino, which modern science can't predict. And he wasn't actually using anything other than Newtonian physics, but it's to do with the sun and the transfer of angular momentum in the solar system. That's the feedback from the planets into the sun. He was also a professional, highly regarded astrologer, Theodore Landscheid. And I said to them, look, I'm going to mention this guy's name because you can get hold of his work, and I would like to see it replicated. No scientist has replicated his work, purely because he was an astrologer. And I said, so was Newton, so was Galileo. And one of the other scientists, who was a woman, said, and Kepler. So I thought, wow, that's great, But by the time you get to kind of Greens and environmental campaigners and stuff, any mention of astrology or homeopathy, which is also, my children all were treated homeopathically, and They went through a Steiner education in their early years, and this is all regarded as wacko territory, as if that proves that my scientific analysis, which isn't mine, it's a review of peer-reviewed science, if you understand the difference, which I thought was pretty obvious, and I'm sure you do. It's my leanings in those directions are used against me, and that's by our own side. So,
well, maybe there aren't on your side, so to speak, anymore. Then, in that sense,
this is what I'm realizing. I don't know what's happened to the environmentalists that I knew. They've been
hijacked in that sense.
They have been hijacked. There's no doubt in my mind now that they don't exist anymore, or they're just they are somewhere, and their voice is not heard.
Well, Peter Taylor, I think this is a good time to wrap things up for this time. We'd love to have you back on the program at some point if you're up for it, and talk more about some of these things, because we hardly get into detail. You've given us a very interesting kind of overview of your story and some of your research that you've been doing. But I'm definitely looking forward, hearing you talk more in Bath, as it were. And again, for people who want to attend the conference, please go to arcconvention.org and check up there more on schedules and times and tickets and all that here. Peter's and a lot of other guest speakers showing up there as well. And you mentioned, of course, your book title, so people know where to go to get some more information about that. Do you have another website or something that you'd like to give out for us as a way of running things up for us, Peter?
No, not at this stage. I am considering making my sort of more spiritual work available. I do have quite a extensive life in that respect. I would say at least 50% of my time is taken up from my early days with yogic training. I went into shamanic training with Native American teachers and Amazonian teachers, and that gives a different perspective on the world, not just the world of nature, but also the world of human beings. And I, particularly with the latest movie Avatar, I think that will shift consciousness. People will be realizing that this civilization has actually started to deteriorate, and that higher consciousness was a state that actually we've lost it a little bit, and that so-called primitive peoples often have a handle on things that we don't have.
Absolutely.
That we have lost, and this is something that this is more of my passion, and I'm going to be writing about this. And I have written a fair amount, but I have a small group with whom I work, and that writing isn't publicly available, and I'm wanting to make that available and to talk more about it.
All right, there we go. Thank you so much, Peter Taylor. Website ethos-uk.com. Keep up the great work. Looking forward to seeing you in Bath, Peter.
Okay, I look forward to that as well, Henrik. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, there you have it, our program with Peter Taylor. Check out our website for much more. As always, related links to our guests' websites, books, and other material can be found via our radio archive. Thank you for listening. My thanks to everyone at Red Ice. Don't forget to sign up for a membership for much more. And we will be back soon with more radio, TV, video commentary, and of course, news. See you soon. Cheers.